You need to understand something before this story goes any further. There is a girl in this story who has not said one word in 3 years. Not to a teacher, not to a doctor, not to the woman who claimed, for a while, to be her aunt. 3 years of silence, and then one gray October afternoon, 47 motorcycles came off Route 9 and filled the gravel lot of a diner in a town most maps don't bother naming, and every one of those riders climbed off, and every one of them went quiet, and they sat. They didn't come to speak for her. They came to be near her. If you've never seen 47 grown men and women in leather and denim go still on purpose, you don't know what stillness can look like. It looked like reverence. It looked like men who had buried brothers, done time, buried children of their own, folding their hands and waiting the way you wait outside a hospital room, like the smallest noise might cost something. Stay until the end of this, not because it ends the way you expect, because it doesn't. This starts smaller than that, the way these things always do. It starts with one man noticing what everyone else in Iron Ridge had trained themselves not to see. The town sits where the state forgot to keep paving, off a 2-lane blacktop that runs through scrub pine and dead corn, past a filling station with its pumps chained shut, and a diner with 3 letters burned out on its sign, so it reads Din R in the daylight, and nothing at all after dark. The air that October smelled like frost coming early, and diesel idling too long. The sky sat low and the color of a nickel. He'd ridden through 100 towns like it, sun-cracked, hollowed out, the kind of place where the gas station clerk knows everyone's business and nobody's help. He noticed the girl the way he noticed things now, not with his eyes first, but with the old part of his chest that had learned, a long time ago, what a person looked like when they were used to being invisible. Barefoot on cold pavement in October. 10 years old, maybe. Hair combed too carefully for a kid nobody was combing hair for out of love. Eyes that didn't move to follow sound the way a child's eyes should. They moved like a soldier's, checking exits. He'd worn that look himself. He'd watched his own daughter wear it, years before the crash that finished what a stepfather's cruelty had started. And some doors in a man don't close all the way, no matter how many miles he puts between himself and the house he can't go back to. He didn't walk toward the girl. Not yet. He just stood by his bike, in the cold, and watched her the way you watch something you already know you can't ride past. His wallet lived in the same pocket it had lived in for 11 years, worn soft as skin, and folded inside it, behind a driver's license that needed renewing, was a strip of paper gone gray at the creases. A date. Nothing else. He didn't need to read it anymore. He could feel it through the leather the way some men feel weather coming in an old break. March the 9th. A birthday that stopped counting the year a guardrail on a wet county road did what 3 years of a stepfather's hands in that house had already started doing. Slow, from the inside, where nobody with a badge or a clipboard ever thought to look. He had rules. Not many. A man who rides 40 years collects them the way he collects scars, one at a time, usually from something that cost him. This was the oldest. He never rode past a child who wouldn't look up. It sounded simple enough to say out loud, simple enough that other men in the club had heard him say it and nodded like it was just a saying, like patriotism or loyalty, something printed on a patch. It wasn't a saying. It was a debt he'd been paying since a spring morning he wasn't there for, since a silence he mistook, back then, for a good day. His daughter had gone quiet for almost a year before anyone understood quiet was the loudest thing a hurt child could do. He'd understood it too late to matter. He understood it now, standing in a gas station lot 2 states from anywhere he called familiar, the way a man understands the smell of smoke before he sees the fire. The girl hadn't moved. She stood near the propane cage, weight on the sides of her feet like the pavement was already too cold to trust flat-footed, watching a spot on the horizon that held nothing he could see. 19 years on a road like this teaches a man what belongs and what doesn't. A rusted ice machine belonged. A closed for deer season sign taped inside the window belonged. A barefoot child in October, alone, with her hair combed like someone's careful hands had done it that morning, and nobody's careful hands anywhere in sight, that did not belong, and something in him that had gone quiet since the funeral sat up like a dog catching a scent through a closed door. He thought about riding on. He always thought about it first. gave the thought its fair hearing, because thinking about it was how he made sure the decision that followed was really his and not just old Grief wearing his boots. Then he crossed the lot, slow, boots loud on the concrete on purpose, so she'd hear him coming and have the choice other people never gave her, to run, to flinch, to decide for herself that he was safe enough to stay still for. She didn't run. She didn't look up either. She didn't run. She didn't look up either. He stopped 6 feet short and let his hands hang loose at his sides, thumbs in his belt loops, the posture of a man who wanted his hands seen and his intentions plain. Behind him, the pumps ticked in the cold. Somewhere a screen door needed oil. Iron Ridge in late September had the look of a place that had been asked to leave and hadn't gotten the message yet. Route 9 ran through it like a vein nobody had bothered to close off. One blinking light, a hardware store with 2 aisles of anything useful and 4 of things nobody bought anymore, and the gas station that had changed names 3 times in the last decade without ever changing the rust on its awning. The diner sat catty-corner from it, a low building with a roofline that sagged in the middle like it was tired of holding itself up, and a sign out front that read EAT in letters that had once said something longer. He'd been coming to that diner on Sundays for going on 6 years, since before the funeral and after it too, because Grief needed a routine the way a wound needed a dressing, something to keep the air off it. He always took the corner booth, the one with the vinyl split along the seam, so a man had to sit a certain way not to feel the foam underneath, and he always ordered the same thing, black coffee and eggs he mostly didn't eat, and he always smoked his first cigarette of the day standing just outside the door, because the waitress had asked him nice about it once, years back, and he'd never made her ask twice. She'd worked that counter 19 years. Long enough to know which trucker tipped and which one talked too much. Long enough to read a man's whole week off the way he set his hat on the table. She called him by a name that wasn't the one on his license, and he'd never corrected her, because some things a person earns by staying. Most Sundays, the rain came in on the tin roof of the station across the road sometime around 10, a sound like static that made the whole town feel underwater, and he'd sit with his coffee and watch it come down over pumps nobody used anymore, thinking about a girl who used to like the sound of rain on a roof, who used to say it sounded like the world clearing its throat. That was the shape of his Sundays: coffee, cigarette, rain if it came. The first Sunday of that particular July, the waitress set his eggs down and didn't walk away right off, which was how he knew she had something to say, and hadn't decided yet if it was worth saying. He waited. He was good at waiting. 30 years of waiting for men to say the thing they were circling had taught him that most people only need the silence held open long enough. "There's a girl comes in some mornings," she said finally, wiping a spot on the counter that didn't need it. "Sits in the corner booth, same one every time, like it's assigned to her." He kept his eyes on the eggs he wasn't going to eat. "She order anything?" "Nothing, not once. Sits there till whoever brought her comes back for her. Never says a word to me. Not thank you, not no thank you, not nothing." She folded the rag over her hand. "I've had shy kids in here 19 years. This isn't shy." "How old?" 9, 10, hard to tell. Small for her age, or maybe just small the way kids get when nobody's feeding them right. Outside, the rain hadn't started yet, but the sky over the dead gas station had that green-gray weight to it that meant it would. He found himself listening for it anyway, out of habit, the way a man checks a watch that stopped working years ago. She with somebody? Woman brings her, says she's the aunt, and rolled her over at the elementary a few weeks back, is what I heard from the Hendricks woman, whose sister does the front office. She shrugged, but it wasn't a careless shrug. Something about it doesn't sit right with me. Woman doesn't look at the girl but twice the whole time they're in here. Girl doesn't look at anybody at all. He turned that over slowly, the way he turned over everything, waiting for the part that would snag. She barefoot? The waitress looked at him a beat too long. Once. First time I saw her. After that, she's had shoes, but they don't fit her. Too big, like somebody handed them down without checking. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He'd learned a long time ago that the things worth noticing were rarely the loud ones. It was always the too big shoes, the corner booth, the meal not ordered, the silence held like a held breath. His own daughter had gone quiet like that once. in stages so small he hadn't caught them until the quiet was total. She in here today? Not today. Comes maybe twice a week. No pattern to it I can find. He finished his coffee, which had gone cold, and set the cup down soft, the way a man sets something down when he doesn't want to be the reason it breaks. Next time she's in, he said, you call the number I gave you for the shop. The waitress didn't ask why. 19 years behind that counter had taught her too, which questions earned an answer, and which just wasted breath. She came in on a Tuesday, 4 days later, and he was there because he had started making sure he was there, 3 afternoons a week, nursing coffee he didn't want at a table, that gave him the whole room in one glance. That was a habit from another life. A man learns to sit where he can see the door, and he never unlearns it, not in 30 years, not after the war ended for everyone else, and kept quietly going for him alone. She came in alone. No woman with her, no aunt, no anyone. She was small in the way that made him think of something folded rather than simply thin, narrow wrists, narrow shoulders, a neck that looked like it was built for a bigger version of her that hadn't arrived yet. Her hair was clean and combed. Someone had seen to that, and her clothes were clean too. A t-shirt a size too large tucked into shorts a size too small. The mismatch of a wardrobe assembled by someone who was guessing. The shoes were exactly what the waitress had said. White, once, now gray at the toe, the kind with laces double knotted by a hand not her own, because the knots were too neat, too adult, the knots of someone who tied them for her and sent her off. She sat in the corner booth without looking at it first, the way people do when they've sat there enough times that the booth has become a kind of skin, and she did not look at the window, though the window faced the road and the light and the one slow truck idling at the pump outside. She looked at the door. He watched her do it and felt something in his chest shift, quiet as a needle finding a groove. He knew that posture. He had held it himself, once, in a hospital hallway, in a courtroom, in the 6 months after his daughter's quiet had become the kind of quiet nothing could talk its way out of. It was the posture of a person who has learned that the exits matter more than the entrances, that whatever is coming for you announces itself first by the door, and if you keep your eyes anywhere else you have already lost the half-second that might save you. She didn't order. The waitress set a glass of water in front of her without asking, and the girl wrapped both hands around it like it was something that needed containing rather than something to drink. He didn't approach her. He had learned that, too, the hard way, decades ago, that you do not walk up on something that's already counting its exits. You let it see you first, from a distance, doing nothing threatening, being simply a shape in a room that does not move toward it. So he sat and drank his cold coffee and watched her watch the door and did not look away when, for 1/2 second, her eyes slid to him instead. That half-second was enough. He'd spent 30 years learning to read what a glance costs a person, and hers had cost something. She looked away first, back to the door, back to her water glass, and the moment closed like a hand. He waited until she'd finished not drinking her water, until the waitress came by again with the coffee pot, and then he asked, low, not looking up from his cup, the way you ask a question you don't want to spook. That one come in here often? The waitress topped off his cup without being asked. 19 years behind that counter taught a person how to answer a question without making it look like an answer. Most days, after school lets out. She glanced toward the booth, quick, careful, the same economy of motion the girl herself used. Doesn't talk, doesn't order. Sometimes I bring her a grilled cheese and she eats half of it and leaves. She got people? The waitress's mouth did something complicated. She set the pot down on the warmer like she needed both hands free for the rest of it. Showed up in July. Some woman brought her in, signed her up at the school, 3rd grade, I think, though she looked small for it, signed the forms as her aunt. She wiped a spot on the counter that didn't need wiping. Nobody around here'd ever laid eyes on the woman before that day. Not from Iron Ridge, not from anywhere close, near as anybody could tell. She's still around? The aunt? That's the thing. The waitress looked at him now, straight on, and there was something old and tired in it, something that had watched too many things come through this town and not enough of them come out right. Nobody's seen her since August. Not at the school, Not at whatever house they were supposed to be staying at. Girl just kept coming here. Kept showing up at school, they tell me, some mornings, not others. Somebody must be feeding her, clothing her, nobody knows who. He turned that over slow, the way he turned over anything that didn't sit flush. A woman who appears with a child and paperwork and a story, and then does not appear again. A child who keeps arriving at the same 3 or 4 places on her own. The way a stray keeps returning to a porch where someone once put out a bowl of food, even after the food stops coming. Anybody call the county on it? The waitress's silence answered before her words did. Same as everywhere, I expect. Everybody figures somebody else already did. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that he'd heard some version of that sentence before, in another town, in another year, spoken about his own daughter's silence, right up until the silence had nowhere left to go. He looked back at the booth. The girl had turned the napkin dispenser slightly, so its steel edge sat between herself and the door. He did not decide to come back the next morning. That was the lie he told himself while he was doing it, gearing up before dawn like a man with somewhere to be, riding the 11 miles of empty 2-lane, in air still cool enough to fog his visor, telling himself it was the coffee, telling himself an old man was allowed to like a diner without it meaning anything. He was in the booth by 6:40. She came in at 6:52. Barefoot again, though the mornings had gone cold enough now that the concrete outside must have bitten at her heels like something with teeth. She didn't look at him. She sat where she always sat, back corner, facing the door, and the waitress brought her the plate without being asked. Eggs, toast, the good syrup instead of the packets, and didn't ring it up, and he pretended not to notice that either. He had bought the notebook the day before, the kind with a wire spine, telling himself it was for logging mileage on the bike. He tore a sheet free at the register while the waitress's back was turned, folded it once, and on the inside, quick, no artistry to it, the same rough lines he used to sketch for his daughter when she was small and wanted to know what he rode. He drew a motorcycle. 2 wheels, a seat, handlebars swept wide, a little flame shape coming off the pipes because that was the kind of thing that made a kid laugh, once, a long time ago. He didn't sign it. He didn't write a word. He set his coffee cup down on his own table like a man settling in, then crossed the diner without hurrying, the way he'd learned decades back to move around anything easily spooked. Cattle, drunks, his own grief. And he laid the folded napkin at the edge of her table, near her elbow, not quite touching her plate. He didn't crouch to her eye level. He didn't say good morning. He turned and walked back to his booth and picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the gas pumps like the last 30 seconds hadn't happened. He did not watch her open it. That was the discipline of it, the same discipline he'd used tracking wounded deer as a boy, the same discipline that had gotten men out of bad country when he was young and scared in a uniform. You did not crowd the thing you wanted to survive. You gave it room to decide you weren't a threat on its own schedule, not yours. When he finally let his eyes drift back, 10 minutes later, the plate was clean, and the napkin was gone from the table. He didn't ask the waitress where it went. He paid for 2 coffees instead of 1, left before the girl did, and sat outside on the bike in the flat early light a long while, not starting the engine, turning something over in his chest he had no good name for yet. 4 days passed before he saw it again. He had told himself he wouldn't come back to the diner every morning, that a man could look too eager even to a child who couldn't say so, and so he'd skipped a day, then forced himself to skip another, sitting instead in the salvage yard behind the clubhouse pretending to care about a carburetor that didn't need him. But Tuesday he was back at the counter at 6:40. Same stool, same coffee, and she was there in the corner booth in the same shoes, 2 sizes too big, hair combed now. Someone had started combing it, and he registered that fact the way he registered tire wear. Data, not sentiment, though it sat in him differently than data usually did. She was swinging her feet under the table, a small motion, almost nothing, and it was that motion that showed him the sock. The shoe had slipped at the heel the way big shoes do, and the sock had ridden down, and there, folded into a hard little square against her ankle bone, was the napkin. He didn't stare. He'd learned that much already. He looked at his coffee, looked at the window, let his eyes come back to her, only in passing glances, the way a man checks a mirror while driving. Brief, habitual, unremarkable to anyone watching, but each glance confirmed it. The napkin had gone soft, the way paper goes soft only from handling, from being unfolded and refolded, worried at with small fingers, the way rosary beads get worried at by old women in church pews. It had a crease pattern now that hadn't been there when he'd drawn it. It had been carried. He thought about his daughter's rabbit's foot, the cheap dyed thing on a keychain she'd kept until she was 14, and too old for it and kept anyway, tucked in a jacket pocket long after the jacket stopped fitting. He had found it in a drawer after the funeral and not been able to throw it away, and it lived now in a coffee can in his garage, with things he could not look at and could not discard. He understood, sitting there, that the napkin had become that for her already, in 4 days, faster than grief usually worked, which told him something about how empty her hands had been before he'd put a folded piece of paper in them. He did not go to her table. He did not smile at her, because a stranger's smile, he'd read once in a training manual he still half remembered from the guard, could read as threat to a nervous animal or a nervous child in equal measure. He finished his coffee. He left his money under the cup the way he always did. On his way out the door, he passed close enough to her booth that if she'd wanted to speak, she could have. She didn't. But her feet stopped swinging as he passed, just for a second, and her eyes came up, and held his, and did not look away first. He walked out into heat that had not broken since noon, and sat in the truck without starting it, hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 like a man in a driving test, and let the memory come because he had learned, over 11 years, that fighting it only made it stay longer. His daughter had been 9 when the quiet started. Not this quiet, not the total sealed silence of the girl in the booth, but a thinning of her voice, a way of answering questions with fewer words each month, until whole sentences went missing from her, the way teeth go missing from a child, one at a time, until you looked up and realized how much was gone. He had been on the road 40 weeks a year then, chapter business, runs, the kind of absence a man tells himself is temporary. Her mother had remarried a man with a good job and a bad smile, and he had not looked closely enough at the smile, because he had told himself it wasn't his place anymore, that a man loses the right to look closely once he's given up the house. She had stopped calling him daddy on the phone before he understood why. She had started saying it was fine when it was not fine. He had noticed, he would tell himself later, in the coffee can hours of the night, that he had noticed, the way she flinched at a raised hand that wasn't even raised at her, the way she went still in a room, the way a rabbit goes still, hoping stillness reads as absence. He had noticed. He had not acted, because acting meant admitting what he was seeing, and admitting it meant burning down whatever peace still existed between him and her mother, and he had chosen the peace. She died 2 years later in a car her stepfather was driving too fast on a wet road, and at the funeral he had stood at the back in his colors because no one had asked him to sit up front, and a woman he didn't know had touched his arm and said she was in a better place now, and he had wanted to put his fist through the church wall. He kept her birthday written in blue ballpoint inside his wallet, behind the license, where his thumb found it without looking. He started the truck now. The diner sign flickered red, then green, then red again in his rear view, the way it did every evening at this hour, and he did not look back at the window, at the booth, at the girl with the folded napkin working itself soft in her sock. He drove the 4 miles home with both hands on the wheel and did not turn on the radio, and somewhere on Route 9, in the deepening dark, he understood that he was not going to be able to leave this the way he'd left the other one. The school sat 2 blocks off the highway, brick the color of dried blood, a flagpole with a rope that clanged against metal every time the wind came through. He parked the truck at the far end of the lot, away from the buses, and sat there a while before he went in, the way he used to sit outside VA buildings before appointments he didn't want to keep. The secretary was maybe 60, cardigan buttoned to the throat despite the heat, and she looked at his cut the way most people in Iron Ridge had learned not to. He told her he was checking on enrollment for a family friend. He gave the girl's name, the one she'd been going by since July. The woman's fingers paused over the keyboard. "There's no birth certificate on file for that name," she said. "We flagged it back when she started. County said give it 30 days, see if the aunt produced one." "Did she?" "No." The secretary looked toward the hallway, empty, humming with fluorescent light. We called the number on the emergency contact card in August. Disconnected. Called it again last week. Same thing. He asked for the number anyway. She hesitated, then wrote it on a sticky note with a pen that skipped, and slid it across the counter like something she didn't want her fingerprints on. "You're not supposed to have this," she said. "I know. She's a sweet kid. Quiet. Never causes trouble." The secretary's mouth tightened at the corner. Nobody ever came to a single conference. Not the aunt, not anybody. He folded the sticky note into his shirt pocket, next to the wallet, next to the ballpoint birthday he never had to look at to find. "You said she's flagged," he said. "What happens to a flagged file?" "Sits. Until somebody with a badge asks about it." She said it plain. No apology in it. A woman who had watched paperwork outlive children before. "We're a school, not the county attorney." He thanked her. She didn't tell him it was nothing. Outside, the flagpole rope clanged again, and he stood by the truck with the sticky note between two fingers, like it might combust, doing the arithmetic he'd done 100 times in 31 years of reading men and roads and weather fronts before they broke. A name with no birth certificate behind it. A number that no longer rang anywhere. A woman who called herself family and vanished before the leaves turned. He thought of the napkin motorcycle gone soft in a child's sock and the 2 words she hadn't written yet, and he understood there was a version of this where he handed the sticky note to somebody with a badge and let it sit in a drawer the way the file had sat, quiet, flagged, forgotten. He got in the truck instead and dialed a number of his own. Not the disconnected one, a different one he trusted, one that used to carry a badge for a living and now carried something sharper. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "It's Marcus," he said, though she already knew, because he was the only man left who still called instead of texting. "I need eyes on something. Not official. Not yet." She was quiet, the way trained people are quiet, letting silence do the asking. He gave her the name with no birth certificate, the disconnected number, the woman who'd vanished before the leaves turned. He heard a pen against a legal pad, the particular scratch of someone who still wrote things down, because writing things down meant they existed. She said she'd make calls in the morning. He said morning felt far away. She told him that was the job, and hung up gentler than she needed to. He didn't go home. He drove instead, west on the 2-lane where the asphalt gave up its edges to gravel, and the gravel gave up to weeds, out past the county line, where the map stopped bothering to name things. The sun was going down orange and cheap behind the tree line, the kind of light that made even ruin look briefly forgiven. He'd heard once, from a man he no longer spoke to, about an old filling station out this way that had closed before the girl in the sock was born. Boarded windows, a pump island rusted to lace, a place nobody had reason to remember. He told himself he was only looking. 31 years on a bike teach a man that looking costs nothing. The station sat off the road like something that had given up apologizing for itself. Behind it, past a collapsed chain-link fence and a stand of sumac gone red early, there was a storm cellar. Steel double doors, boarded over with plywood gray and swollen from seasons of rain, a padlock rusted into uselessness, holding nothing. He stood a long time before he crouched. Scratched into the doorframe, low, at the height a small hand would reach if it was sitting rather than standing, was a drawing. Lines cut shallow and patient into old wood, a shape that took him a moment to read as a house, and beside it, smaller, a shape that took him no time at all to read as a girl. He did not touch the boards. He did not pry at the lock that wasn't a lock anymore. Some part of him, the part that had walked into rooms in another country and learned the difference between a scene and a situation, understood this was the former, a thing to be documented, not disturbed, a thing bigger than one man with a flashlight and a grudge against every quiet house in America. He took a photograph with a phone he barely knew how to use, his thumb shaking once before it steadied. He wrote down the mile marker. He memorized the slant of the drawing, the small, stubborn pressure it must have taken to scratch a house and a girl into wood with, what? A nail, a spoon. He didn't let himself finish that thought. Then he walked back to the truck, past the dead pumps, into the dark, already reaching for the phone again. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. And even in the silence before her voice, he could hear the particular quiet of a woman who had spent 30 years answering calls at 3 in the morning and learned not to dread them, only to prepare for them. She had been retired 6 years. She still sounded like she was on shift. He told her about the boards, the frame, the shape scratched into old wood, by something that was not a nail, though he suspected it was. He told her about the mile marker, the dead pumps, the smell of standing water that had no business being under a filling station in a county this dry. He did not tell her about the girl at the counter. Not yet, not because he was hiding her, but because he did not trust himself to say her name. She had no name, not one that matched anything, without his voice doing something he didn't want it to do, on a call that needed to stay clean. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. He had learned, over the 2 months he'd known her, that her silences were not empty, they were her working. You didn't touch it. No. Good. A pause, the scrape of a chair, somewhere on her end a dog settling with a groan. I need you to hear this part and not argue with me. I'm listening. Kids come up quiet like this, mute. I mean, really mute, not shy. When something underneath them finally lets go. Could be the person. Could be circumstance. Could be the whole thing just ran out of road. But when they surface, the silence isn't empty either. It's the only thing holding the floor together for them. You push on it, ask her straight what she saw, what he did, who he was. You're not getting an answer. You're getting a collapse. He looked out the truck window at the dark shape of the station receding in the mirror. Unlit, unremarkable, the kind of place 10,000 people had driven past without a second glance. So I do nothing. You do less than you want to. That's not nothing. He heard her exhale, long, the sound of someone who had sat across from 100 children like this one and never gotten used to it. You let her keep coming to that counter. You let the waitress keep calling her honey. You let the silence do what it's doing, which is healing something you can't see the shape of yet. And you let me start pulling the paperwork, the aunt, the enrollment, the birth record that isn't there. That's real work. That's work with your name nowhere near it. And if I push, and I'm wrong, then she goes quiet somewhere you can't follow her back from. He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. Behind him, the station kept its drawing in the dark, and ahead of him the road ran on toward a diner where a girl was, right now, probably tracing a fork through the last of her syrup, waiting for nothing, expecting nothing, having long ago stopped believing that anyone was coming. He rode the last 4 miles with the visor down, though the sun had already gone soft and orange behind the grain elevators, because he needed something between his face and the wind, some barrier against how badly he wanted to turn the bike around. 2 counties over. A boarded door. A drawing scratched into the frame by a hand that could not have been more than 8 years old at the time. He could be there in 40 minutes. He could put a boot through rotted plywood, could stand in whatever dark that door was hiding, could see with his own eyes what her silence had been circling for 3 years, like water around a drain. Every mile of muscle in him wanted that. It was the same want that had once made him climb through a windshield to reach his daughter before the paramedics did. The same want that had taught him nothing, changed nothing, only left him with a date written inside a wallet and a lifetime of arriving too late to matter. He didn't turn around. He thought about what the investigator had said, the shape of it plain as a fence line, a door forced open by an angry man, was a door a lawyer could argue was compromised. A seller entered without a warrant, without a badge, without the slow, unglamorous machinery of subpoenas and birth records, was a seller that might never convict anyone of anything. He knew men who'd learned that lesson late, who'd gotten their justice and lost their case in the same breath, who'd spent the rest of their lives certain and unable to prove a thing. So he let the exit for the county road go by without slowing, watched it shrink in the mirror the way the filling station had shrunk that morning, and he did not let himself look back twice. This was the line, then, not the ones stitched into his cut, not the ones tattooed faded blue down both forearms. This one, invisible, harder to hold than any of those. He would not go to that cellar. He would not touch that door. He would not let his own hunger for an ending put a 10-year-old's healing, or her case, or her chance at a courtroom that actually held, at risk for the sake of his own 5 minutes of feeling useful. It cost him more than riding there would have. Patience always did. Rage was easy. Rage he'd been fluent in since before she was born. This was the harder language, the one where a man sat still and let a woman with a folder and a badge number do the slow work while he did nothing but keep showing up at a counter, keep letting a waitress pour coffee he didn't finish, keep letting a barefoot girl in borrowed shoes decide, on her own clock, what she was ready to hand him. He throttled down instead at the crossroads, killed the engine, and sat a long minute in the ticking quiet, listening to his own blood settle, before he turned the bike back toward Iron Ridge. Rain came to Iron Ridge on a Tuesday in October, the kind of rain that didn't announce itself so much as arrive already falling, gray and steady against the diner's windows until the parking lot outside was a sheet of moving light. He came in soaked to the collar, boots leaving dark prints across the linoleum, and the waitress didn't say a word about it, just poured his coffee and left the pot within reach, the way she'd started doing weeks back, like a woman setting a place for someone she expected to stay. The girl was already at the counter. She'd taken to arriving before him some days now, a small fact he tried not to make too much of, sitting with her hands folded around a glass of water she never drank, watching the door the way he watched roads, for what was coming, not what had already passed. He sat 2 stools down. Old habit. Distance was a language he'd learned to speak fluently before he'd learned almost anything else worth knowing. The rain kept on. Somewhere behind the counter, a radio murmured, weather nobody was listening to. He shrugged out of his jacket and hung it wet over the stool back, and it was then, without a word, without the smallest change in her face to warn him, that she reached over. Her finger found the patch on his vest, not the club's colors, the small one beneath, the pair of stitched wings the chapter's wives had sewn into a strip of leather, sized for a child half his weight. She traced the shape slowly, the way a person reads something in a language they are only starting to learn, first one wingtip, then the curve down to where the feathers met. He didn't move. He had spent 30 years training his body not to flinch at things it should have flinched at, and now he found all that training bent toward the opposite purpose, holding still for something that deserved stillness, not because it was dangerous but because it was rare. She traced the wing a second time, then she took her hand back, folded it into her lap with the other, and looked down at her water glass, as if she'd only just remembered it was there. The waitress, refilling a sugar dispenser 3 feet away, had gone very quiet, and when he glanced at her, she gave him a look he understood without translation. 19 years behind that counter, and she knew exactly what she'd just watched. First voluntary touch in 3 years. Not words. Not yet. But a hand reaching, on her own, toward something stitched by people who had never met her, and had made it anyway, on the chance it would someday matter to somebody. He didn't say thank you, didn't say anything. He just let his coffee go cold in front of him, same as always, and watched the rain keep coming down outside like it had all the time in the world. The waitress locked the front door at 9, same as every night, and flipped the sign without ceremony, and he stayed in his booth the way he'd taken to staying, not asking permission anymore, just present the way weather is present. The rain had not let up. It came down steady and unhurried against the dark windows, and the diner held its light like something cupped in 2 hands. She was still at the counter when the last of the regulars filed out, swinging her legs slightly, not looking at anyone, and the waitress set a fresh napkin dispenser down near her the way you'd set food in front of a stray, not expecting anything, just making the offer. She took one. He watched her fold it once, crease it hard with her thumbnail the way she'd done with the motorcycle drawing, and for a moment he thought she meant to draw again, another wing, another wheel, something safe and wordless. Instead, she reached into the cup of pens by the register, the same cheap ballpoints the waitress used for checks, and she wrote 3 words. Small, careful, the letters a child's letters, pressed so hard into the paper that they nearly tore through. He said stay. She slid it across the counter the way she'd once traced a stitched wing, then took her hand back fast, like the napkin might do something if she kept touching it. He did not reach for it right away. He made himself read it twice from where he sat, the way you'd read a map before trusting your weight to a bridge. Not, I stayed. Not, I couldn't leave. He said stay. An order. Somebody's order, given once, obeyed for 3 years past whatever room it had been spoken in. The waitress had gone still behind the counter, dish towel forgotten in her hand, and when he finally stood and crossed to the stool beside the girl, he moved the way he'd moved toward something wounded that could still bolt. He didn't ask who. He knew better than to spend the only sentence she'd handed him on a question she wasn't ready to answer. "Okay," he said instead, low, even. "You don't have to stay anymore. Not for him, not for anybody." She didn't look up, but her shoulders came down half an inch, the smallest release, like a held breath finally let out through the nose instead of the mouth. He folded the napkin along its crease and did not put it in his pocket. He set it flat on the counter between them, where she could see it, where it was still hers to take back if she wanted, and he thought of a storm cellar somewhere he hadn't seen yet, of a door frame scratched with a child's hand, of a name he still didn't have and would need before this was over. 3 words. Not a confession. A door left open a crack, for the first time in 3 years, by somebody deciding it was finally safe enough to try. He waited until she'd finished the eggs the waitress brought without being asked, until the fork had gone still against the plate and her eyes had drifted toward the window where the heat made the gas pumps shimmer like something underwater. Then he walked outside, past the bike, past the ashtray somebody had left balanced on the newspaper box, and he called the only number that mattered before he called the one that was supposed to matter first. He knew the order things were meant to go in. 22 years wearing the patch had taught him that much. You called it in, you gave the county your coordinates, you let the machinery that existed for exactly this kind of morning grind forward with its forms and its caseworkers and its rooms, with 2 chairs and a box of tissues nobody ever used until the 3rd question. He had sat in those rooms once, a lifetime ago, across from people who wrote things down and believed his daughter less than they believed the man who'd taught her to lie about the bruises. He remembered the particular silence of being disbelieved by someone whose job was to listen. He was not going to let this girl sit in that silence alone. So instead he thumbed through the contacts until he found the vice president's name, and when the voice on the other end answered flat and sleep-rough, he said only, "I need bodies. Not for a fight, for a girl." He gave the town. He gave the diner. He said the word now. The way he'd say it in a situation gone sideways on a run, and he heard, in the pause that followed, the sound of a man already reaching for his boots. Then he called the next chapter over, and the one after that, and he did not explain more than he had to, because explaining took time, and time was the one thing he'd decided. Standing in that parking lot with the sun already ironing the blacktop white, he was no longer willing to spend carefully. He thought of rooms full of adults nodding politely at a child, and believing none of it. He thought of a napkin folded along its crease, sitting on a counter, still hers to take back. He was not calling for violence, and he told himself that twice, out loud, to make it true. He was calling so that when the county finally sent someone with a clipboard and a badge, that person would walk into a diner that did not feel like a room where a 10-year-old could be outvoted. 47 riders before the week was out would answer that call. He did not know the number yet. He only knew he'd crossed something just now that could not be walked back. Procedure be damned. And that the girl inside, still watching the pumps shimmer, had no idea yet how large the world was about to get on her behalf. He made 3 calls from the payphone, bolted to the side of the station, because his own phone had died sometime after midnight, and because a payphone, he'd learned decades ago, made a man choose his words the way a landline always had. Slow, deliberate, no room for the noise of a screen between the sentence and the listener. The first call went to a Chapter 2 counties north. The second went west, toward a clubhouse he hadn't set foot in since a funeral 11 years back. The third went to a man he trusted, the way he trusted very few, a president who did not raise his voice even when the news was bad. All 3 said some version of the same thing, and none of them knew the others had said it. A child seen walking the shoulder of Route 9 in April, no shoes, gone before anyone could stop the truck to ask her name. A girl at a rest stop outside a town 2 hours west, silent, clutching a windbreaker too large for her, escorted off by a woman who did all the talking. A boy, this one, back in February, found sitting on a guardrail at 2 a.m. by a trucker who called it in and never heard what happened after. He wrote none of it on paper. He'd learned that too. Paper could be subpoenaed, paper could be lost, paper could be waved off as coincidence by someone with a badge and no patience. He kept it instead the way his father had kept the mileage on trucks he could not afford to have break down, in his head, in order, with the weight of each one pressing down on the last. 3 counties, 3 sightings, 3 separate men who ran clubs that didn't often speak to each other outside of funerals and charity runs, each of them saying, unprompted, that something had passed through their stretch of highway this year and left no name behind. He stood with the receiver still warm against his ear, long after the last call ended, watching a heat shimmer lift off the pumps like something trying to leave the ground. He thought of the napkin folded on the counter inside. He thought of a name with no birth record. He thought, for the first time, that the girl might not be the beginning of anything. She might be the middle of something that had been moving along this road for longer than a summer, longer than he wanted to count. He walked back inside slower than he'd walked out, because the numbers in his head had rearranged the shape of the morning, and a man did not carry that kind of arithmetic into a room with a child in it without first deciding what his face was going to do. Through the window he could see her still at the counter, elbows on the formica, watching the waitress top off a coffee she hadn't asked for. She had no idea the highway outside had just gotten longer. He called the investigator from the payphone outside because his own phone had become a thing he didn't trust with this. Not yet. Not until someone with a badge history could tell him whether he was building a case or building a rumor. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, like she'd been sitting with the receiver already in her hand. He gave her the disconnected number. He gave her the county 2-over, the filling station, the cellar door with its scratched drawing that nobody official had photographed yet because nobody official knew to look. She was quiet for a while after that. The kind of quiet he'd learned meant she was writing. 2 days later she called back with a voice flattened by fatigue and something else, something closer to dread. The number had belonged, briefly, to a prepaid phone activated in one name and abandoned within a month. That name matched no address, no lease, no light bill, but a partial match on the enrollment paperwork, a signature, of all things, a particular loop in the letter that a records clerk 2 counties north remembered seeing before, tied it to a woman who had enrolled a different child in a different school 4 years earlier under a different aunt's name in a town he'd never heard of. 2 that we know of, she said. Could be more we don't. He stood with his hand against the booth's hot metal frame and did not answer right away. If we move now, she said, official, loud, warrants. He hears about it before we're halfway there. Man like this doesn't fight. He disappears, changes a name, changes a county, and some other kid down the road starts using her hands instead of her mouth. And if we don't move, then we're betting he stays still long enough for us to be quiet enough. He thought about the girl at the counter, elbows on the formica, waiting for pancakes she hadn't asked for and might never ask for, and about a man somewhere teaching himself a new name, the way other men learned a trade. He thought about how much silence it took to keep a child safe versus how much silence it took to let a predator walk free one more season. You keep this off the radio, he said. You keep this between the people who need it. That's the only way I know how to keep it, she said. He hung up and stood there a moment longer, the heat pressing down on him like a hand deciding whether to close, and understood, with the flat certainty of a man reading weather, that the quiet was no longer a mercy. It was a countdown neither of them had agreed to start. The morning came in gray, the kind of sky that refused to commit to rain or heat, and by 7 the first engines were already threading through Iron Ridge like a low tide coming in ahead of schedule. He had made calls the night before, short ones, the kind that didn't explain themselves. Tomorrow, diner, quiet. That was all the message needed to be. Men who had ridden with him for 20 years didn't ask why, they asked what time. By 8 the lot behind the diner was full, and by 8:30 they had started parking along the shoulder of Route 9 itself, kickstands down in the gravel, chrome dulled under the flat light. The investigator stood near the door with a clipboard she wasn't using, counting anyway, because counting was what she did with her hands when her mind was somewhere else. 47, she said, when he passed her. You didn't tell them what for. They didn't ask. Inside, the booths filled slow and deliberate, Men easing into the vinyl seats, like they were sitting down to a shift of work rather than breakfast, ordering coffee they'd let go cold, leaving the pancakes for someone who might want them. Vests hung heavy with patches faded by 3 different decades of weather. Nobody spoke above a murmur. Nobody looked at the girl directly, which was its own kind of looking. The deliberate, careful non-stare of men who understood that being watched too hard was its own violence. She came in at 9, in her sock feet inside the oversized shoes, and stopped in the doorway the way a deer stops at a tree line, reading the room before deciding it was safe to enter it. He watched her count them too, though she didn't move her lips the way the investigator had. Her eyes went booth to booth, vest to vest, patch to patch, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch, the way a held breath comes out slow instead of all at once. The waitress set a plate in front of her without being asked. Outside, past the window glass, 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled through town toward the county line, toward 2 counties over, toward a boarded cellar behind a filling station nobody had pumped gas from in a decade. Nobody in the diner turned to watch them go. That was the arrangement, unspoken and total. The department did the finding, the club did the staying, and the girl sat in the middle of both, surrounded not by strangers with badges or reporters with cameras, but by 47 men who had shown up for no other purpose than to be furniture around her, immovable and unremarkable, until whatever news was coming had somewhere safe to land. He sat 2 stools down from her and did not speak. He didn't need to. The room was already saying it for him. The plate sat untouched. Toast, going cold at the edges, steam long gone. She looked at it the way she looked at everything now, like she was cataloging it rather than wanting it, and then her eyes went back to the room, to the vests, to the boots planted wide under booth tables built for families that weren't coming. The door chimed again. 2 more came through it, unhurried, nodding once to the room the way men nod when they already know they belong somewhere. Nobody turned. Nobody made a production of the count. He watched her track them the same way she'd tracked all the others, patient, silent, cataloging weight and distance and exits, the way a person learns to when a room has taught them that people are not safe until proven otherwise. Then something changed. It wasn't sudden. Nothing about her ever was. She set both hands flat on the table, the way a person braces before standing on a leg that hasn't been trusted in a long time. She pushed the plate 2 inches away from her, deliberate, final. She slid out of the booth. The room did not still, because the room had already been still, but he felt something in it tighten, the way air tightens before weather. She crossed the linoleum in her oversized shoes, the ones 2 sizes too big, the ones that made her steps sound like a smaller person, trying on a larger one's life. She did not look at any single man as she passed. She looked at the counter, at the woman behind it who had worked that register for 19 years and had never once, in 3 years, heard this child's voice. She stopped at the stool. She did not sit. She stood there, small enough that the counter came up near her chin, and she looked up at the waitress with the same directness she'd used counting patches, counting boots, counting everyone in that room, and finding, apparently, an answer she could live with. Her mouth moved. The word came out cracked, like a hinge that hadn't turned in years, rust flaking off it on the way. But it came out whole. Pancakes. Nobody moved. Nobody gasped. It was not that kind of room, and this was not that kind of miracle. It did not announce itself, it simply arrived, the way water finally reaches a place it had been pressing toward all along. The waitress's hand, reaching for the order pad, stopped halfway. She looked at the girl for a long moment, and something in her face did what faces do when 19 years of ordinary mornings suddenly hold something they were never built to hold. "You got it, sweetheart," she said, and her voice broke on the second word. He sat 2 stools down, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup gone lukewarm, and did not trust himself yet to breathe normal. The pancakes came with a stack of butter that melted too fast in the July heat, and she ate them with the fierce, methodical concentration of someone who had learned not to trust that a plate would still be there in 5 minutes. He watched her fork rise and fall. He did not speak. Speaking felt, suddenly, like the wrong instrument for the moment, like trying to tune a radio with a hammer. The call came through the investigator 2 days later. The cellar behind the abandoned filling station, 2 counties over, had been searched top to bottom by a crime scene unit that photographed the scratch drawing in the doorframe before they photographed anything else. A child's hand, a house with too many windows, a sun with a face on it. The structure itself was empty. Whatever had lived there had left no bedding, no supplies, nothing but a smell the investigator described once, flatly, and never again. But it was evidentiary. That was the word she used, standing in the diner parking lot with her arms crossed against the wind. Evidentiary. Enough to move on. The arrest happened 3 days after that, 2 towns over, at a rented storage unit registered to a name that did not match the name on the false aunt's paperwork, which did not match the name on the girl's school enrollment. A chain of aliases collapsing all at once, like a shelf finally giving way under weight it had carried too long. He was not there for it. He heard about it secondhand, standing in the clubhouse lot with his phone against his ear, gravel crunching under his boots as he shifted his weight, and he found he had nothing to say to the news except a long exhale that fogged briefly in the morning cool. The relative was found through the investigator's own records. A woman 2 states south, licensed, vetted, a second cousin on the mother's side who had been searching, quietly and without money for lawyers, for 3 years. The paperwork moved faster than paperwork usually moved. He suspected the investigator had made calls that weren't strictly procedure. He did not ask. He drove out to the school the day the placement was finalized, parked across the street where he always parked, and watched through the chain link as she stood in the yard during recess, not playing, just standing, watching the other children the way she'd once watched Patches and Boots, counting, assessing, deciding. She looked up once, toward the fence, toward the bike parked crooked at the curb. She did not wave. She held up 2 fingers, the way she'd learned to count vests in a room full of strangers, and folded them down slowly, one at a time, until her hand was closed. He understood it as a kind of goodbye that wasn't finished yet. The vest took the wives 11 days to finish. They worked on it in the back room of the clubhouse, passing it hand to hand under the fluorescent light, arguing in low voices about the size of the stitching, the placement of the single patch, a small embroidered rose, thread the color of the inside of a shell, sewn just above where a heart would sit if the leather had one. He watched them work one evening and said nothing, because there was nothing useful a man could add to that kind of labor. He only noticed that none of them rushed it. He drove down on a Saturday with the club's blessing, which had come without him needing to ask for it, a nod from the vice president, a hand on his shoulder from the sergeant-at-arms, the unspoken understanding that this was hers now, the way the napkin drawing had become hers, the way certain things pass out of an organization's hands into something smaller and more permanent. She was sitting on the porch steps of the cousin's house when he pulled up, and she watched him get off the bike with the vest folded over one arm the way she'd once watched him fold his hands on a diner counter, reading him before he said a word. He held it out. She did not take it right away. She looked at the rose stitched above the heart place for a long moment, the way she'd looked at the storm cellar door frame in the photograph, the way she'd looked at everything that mattered before she let herself believe it was real. Then she put it on. It hung a little large on her, the shoulders sitting wrong, the hem past where a vest should end, and she did not look like a biker's kid so much as a girl wearing proof of something. She did not smile. She turned once, slowly, so he could see the back of it, empty except for that single patch, and he understood the emptiness was not an oversight. It was room. It was years she hadn't lived yet, waiting to be earned and stitched in one at a time. School picture day came 9 days later. The cousin sent no photograph, only a single line relayed through the investigator, who relayed it to him without embellishment, because she knew he didn't need embellishment. The girl had worn the vest over her dress, insisted on it, would not be talked out of it, and the photographer had let her. He kept that sentence the way he kept the napkin, folded, unglamorous, essential, and did not tell anyone at the clubhouse for 3 days, because some things needed to sit in a man's chest a while before they could be spoken without his voice breaking. Time did what time does when a wound is finally allowed to close instead of just scab over. It widened. Months went by the way months go when a man is not counting them for pain anymore. A season of rides, a winter of engine rebuilds in the cold garage, a spring where the chapter patched in 2 new prospects and buried one old member whose lungs finally gave out after 40 years of unfiltered cigarettes. He kept the napkin behind his visor through all of it. He did not need to look at it. He knew it was there the way a man knows his own pulse. The letter came in the 2nd year, in an envelope with a return address he did not recognize until he saw the handwriting on the front, no longer the careful, effortful print of a child copying letters she'd only recently trusted herself to make, but something looser now, something with slant and rhythm, a hand that had stopped thinking about each stroke. She wrote that there had been a talent show, middle school, she wrote, as if the word itself were an accomplishment, which it was. She wrote that she had read a poem in front of the whole gymnasium, that her hands had shook so bad at first she'd had to hold the paper against her chest to still it, and that she had looked out once at all those faces and found she did not recognize the fear she'd expected to find in herself. She wrote that the poem was about a road. She did not say which road. She did not have to. She wrote that afterward a teacher had asked where she'd learned to stand so still while she spoke, like she wasn't afraid of the silence after each line, and she had told the teacher she'd learned it from somebody who used to sit with her at a diner counter and never once rush her toward a word. She wrote that she still had the vest, that it fit her shoulders now instead of hanging off them, that there was a second patch on it, small, plain, sewn on by the woman who'd raised her these 2 years, marking nothing more than a full school year survived without incident, without disappearance, without the ground opening again beneath her feet. She wrote, at the very end, in the same unadorned hand she'd used for the napkin all those years ago, 3 words that were not a plea this time but a report, filed the way a soldier files a report from ground that has finally gone quiet. I still ride. He read it twice at the kitchen table before he folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept the things that could not be replaced, and then he sat a long while with his coffee gone cold, thinking that some roads, once a man rides them all the way through, never really let him go, and he was glad, this once, not to be let go. He kept riding for 6 more years after that letter, though his knees told him, most mornings, that the riding was borrowed time. The chapter had new patches now, younger men who had heard the story secondhand, retold at cookouts until it had the smooth, worn shape of legend, the girl, the diner, the 47 bikes lined up on Route 9, like something out of a dream nobody quite believed they'd lived. He let them tell it their way. He never corrected the parts they got wrong, the exaggerations, the embellishments that crept in the way they always do. What he never told them, because it did not translate into the kind of story men repeat over beers, was the quiet of that day. That was the part that stayed with him, the part he turned over on long, empty stretches of highway when the engine hum went low and steady enough to think. 47 men had ridden in, and not one of them had said a word to her. They had sat. They had ordered coffee they didn't finish and pie they picked at, and they had let a diner in a town called Iron Ridge fill up with the low rumble of leather and gray beards and old scars, and they had made, without meaning to, the loudest silence he had ever been part of. It was not the silence of men with nothing to say. It was the silence of men who understood, each in his own ruined way, that a child who has been taught that speaking gets you hurt does not need noise. She needs proof. 47 men showing up and staying and asking for nothing was proof of a kind that words could not have carried. He still had the helmet. The visor had been replaced twice, the leather reworked once, but tucked behind the plastic, worn soft at the edges from 30 years of weather, was the napkin. The motorcycle drawn in a child's uncertain hand, the lines gone faint now, nearly the color of the paper itself. He did not need to look at it to know it was there. That was not the point of keeping it. The point was that some mornings, before he swung a leg over the bike, he touched the visor the way another man might touch a photograph in a wallet, and he thought, without needing to say it aloud to anyone, that the girl at the counter that morning hadn't needed rescuing so much as she'd needed a room safe enough to use her own voice in, and that the safest rooms a man could build, it turned out, were the ones where nobody said a single word.